Hey, what's up, guys? Mr. Castro here. We're going to take a look at the beginnings of the American Revolution. So we're going to take a look at chapter 6, 7, and 8. Chapter 6 begins to focus on the coming of the French and then the battle that's going to take place for North America. So one of the things that's important to understand is just the coming of the French, right? So France was also a latecomer, or I should say latecomer, not latercomer, to the race for the colonies. Similar things with like England, foreign and domestic strife, things that were going on during the 16th century, right? So during the 1500s. In 1598, they actually signed what was called the Edict of Nantes. It allowed limited toleration to French Huguenots, who were the French Protestants. So it was the opposite of England, right? Where in England, what you had was a dominant group of Protestants. Well, in France, it was dominated by Catholics. And so then what the Edict of Nantes did was it was going to allow for religious toleration towards French Protestants. 1608, King Louis the 14th, the Sun King, was the one who took the interest in the colonial empire. In 1608, France established Quebec as a trading post. The guy who essentially is nicknamed the father of New France, or the establishment of these colonies, is a guy by the name of Samuel de Champlain. Established friendly relation with the Huron, and this is really important because the Huron hated the Iroquois, and the Iroquois will be loyal to the English. One of the things that's really important to understand too is that New France did not grow as fast as England did, or the English colonies. So we're taking a look at it here is a map, some of the areas, right, in terms of New France. So if we look at the map, one of the things that we can see is Quebec, for example, right there, right, some of the areas that were established, Montreal, some of the things, so essentially, right, with New France, what you're going to have is the areas established like right around here, and then eventually areas right around here. So the idea will be that France, they wanted to actually, right, you can see here, establish a line, okay, along the Mississippi River. And so here are the British, here are the French, right? So this is not going to be good. And of course, you have Spain over here, and then you have natives, right, over here. So, like I said, the 1598 Edict of Nantes like I said before, it allowed for religious toleration. This is going to be really important, right? Because part of why the English left was because they were seeking religious toleration. Well, if you're French, would you really want to leave France if they are religiously tolerant, right? Something to think about. So here's a picture of King Louis the 14th, right? Samuel de Champlain, picture of Quebec City in 1608. So the most valuable resource of New France became the beaver, and the reason why is because of these things. They started making these felt hats. They became very popular. Later on, Benjamin Franklin, when he starts wearing them, he makes them even more popular, especially like in Europe when he wears them. The beaver hunters, the French beaver hunters, were known as coureurs de bois, so runners of the woods. French Catholics had difficult time converting the natives, right, because their own religious policies, right? They believed in the things that they wanted to. They were only interested in trade. The threat of the English colonies led a Frenchman by the name of Antoine Cadillac to start the city, or found the city of Detroit in 1701. So it is established as a fort city to protect New France from the British. And yes, right, being that it's Detroit, that's where the automobile industry was. That is why the GM car company, right, Cadillac, is named after Antoine Cadillac. And the actual emblem, the Cadillac emblem, for those of you whose families maybe have a Cadillac, the actual emblem of the car is Antoine Cadillac's coat of arms. In 1682, a guy by the name of Robert de La Salle, he's the one that's going to explore the Mississippi River for the French. He's going to go all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico, and he will be the founder of Louisiana and New Orleans, because of the area in France called Orleans, and of course he calls it Louisiana for King Louis. So picture here the coureurs de bois with the natives, right? Probably. So you can see Cadillac's routes. So again, establishing Fort Detroit, right? So you can see here in the picture. But again, coming in through St. Lawrence. Picture of, again, Antoine Cadillac. Louisiana. So again, like I was telling you guys, right, pretty much what you have here is English, right? And then you can see the French making their way around here. So this area here will essentially be French, which means this area here, okay, is going to be disputed, right, and fought for, right? And so of course you have Spain here, okay, and eventually here, okay. So again, picture of Robert de La Salle. So a couple of things that are important to know. So there are going to be a series of wars. And some of them are not even really wars, but a series of wars that are going to be really important, that are going to eventually lead to the all-important French and Indian War. Okay, so these two right here, we'll talk a little bit about more in class, King William's War and Queen Anne's War. These two are important, and the reason why is because they essentially, that area that I was showing you in the back, it's going to involve English frontiersmen, right, and the French fur trappers. So the reason this is important is because it does not involve any soldiers from France or England. It's essentially going to be fought in the forest, right, in the backwoods. And so yet, it's still two different wars that are going to happen. So King William's War and Queen Anne's War. So they're both really important for that reason. And then, as in 1713, what ends up happening is we get what is called the Treaty of Utrecht. Okay, and we're going to talk more about that too. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, it established a period of relative peace. And what that means is that there was increased salutary neglect because the French and the British were not fighting. The colonists are going to be able to smuggle in a lot more French sugar, a lot of molasses, right? Because the British weren't paying attention, quote unquote. But then what ends up happening is a third war begins. We'll talk a little bit more in detail in class. This war, right, is called the War of Jenkins' Ear. We'll talk about the real name and all that stuff. The War of Jenkins' Ear is important because it does involve troops, okay, from both sides. Now, what's going to be important about that is the troops will remain, okay. But all three of these clashes between the French and the English are eventually going to lead to this fourth war, which is the French and Indian War. But all in all, right, it's because of this, okay, control of North American land. So King William's War, again, like I said, we'll take a look and we'll talk a little bit about each of these. Queen Anne's War, again, we'll talk about these. Okay, War of Jenkins' Ear, just how much was involved. We'll talk more. So King William's War and Queen Anne's War, right? Like I said, English colonists and French Coeur d'Ivoire fought along the Ohio River Valley. It involved no troops. Queen Anne's War, like I said, ended with the Treaty of Utrecht. And again, it extended salutary neglect, right, between 1713 and 1739. Okay. So, ended general peace, the War of Jenkins' Ear, right? That general peace that I was talking about. What ended up happening was English Captain Robert Jenkins' ear was cut off by Spanish commander. This became known as the War, King George's War. So it involved Spanish and the English, but however, the French decided that there was the perfect opportunity to take advantage and to actually side with the Spanish and actually go to war with the English over the land. So France allied itself with Spain. One of the things we'll talk about is the importance of this and the importance of remaining troops. So Fort Louisbourg is really important, okay? So this fort right here was pointing its guns at the colonists, okay? And so one of the things that happens is the colonists captured it, and as a result of the treaty that ends the War of Jenkins' Ear, the colonists are forced to give it back, and it makes them really upset that England would be willing to give it back to the French. The Ohio River Valley became the battleground for the Spanish, the British, and the French. Everybody wanted its very fertile soil. 1754, the governor of Virginia, a guy by the name of Robert Dinwiddie, sent a very young lieutenant by the name of George Washington, 21 years old, to kindly ask the French to leave. And what had happened was the French had built a fort along the Ohio River Valley called Fort Duquesne. It's actually the site of a university today called Duquesne University. And so it becomes eventually the city of Pittsburgh, too. So what happened was the French had established this fort, and the governor says, yeah, George Washington, can you go ask the French to leave, please? So Washington and 150 men, they went to ask the French to leave, and then they noticed that the French were on their way to them too. So then the British, the men George Washington was leading, they parked themselves and they built a smaller fort called Fort Necessity. And what ends up happening is they essentially will meet up the French, and before they can reach Fort Duquesne, and Washington and his men get their butts handed to them. Luckily for us, the French allowed George Washington to get back on his horse and march back to the governor to let him know we are not leaving. Because the French soldiers had essentially attacked the British soldiers, this is the cause of the French and Indian War. And so it is going to last, right, from 1754, okay, to 1763. So in the colonies, right, the magic number is 9 years. However, this same war in Europe is called the 7 Years' War, right? So one of the things you should be asking yourselves is why? So here's George Washington, a really young George Washington. You can't see in the picture, but he's actually wearing red. So the French and Indian War, like I said, we'll take a look a little bit at some of the maps and stuff when we talk about the war. I'm actually going to show you guys a scene from Last of the Mohicans. So again, in Europe, it became known as the 7 Years' War. And so what ends up happening is for the first 2 years of the war, right, it's going to be essentially English and their native allies against the French and their native allies. So what ends up happening is the English decide, you know what? We are going to do something really interesting 2 years into the war. So the English decided that they were going to try to occupy the French with a war in Europe too. So the English crown decided that they were going to pay Frederick the Great of Prussia, which is today, right, Eastern Germany. They were going to pay him to essentially invade or attack France. So he said, yes, of course. So what ends up happening is the French will now be at war with Prussia. And that's going to force the French to actually have to split its military. And as a result of splitting its military, right, it's going to be limited, or it's going to have less of an opportunity, right, to deploy all of its military against the English in the colonies. So 7 Years' War in Europe, right? So again, you can see, right, Prussia right here. Okay. So one of the things that immediately happens, I don't know if you guys know this, but a lot of people think New York City is the capital of New York. It's not. It's actually Albany, New York. That's the capital. So Benjamin Franklin, I know a lot of you are familiar with, he got heavily involved in the French and Indian War. I know a lot of you are familiar probably with the Join or Die cartoon. We will look at it in class also. But one of the things that ends up happening is George Washington decides that he wants to do everything he can to ensure that the war goes in favor of the English. And so one of the things he did is they created a meeting in Albany, New York. And there were two goals of the meeting. The first goal, the short-term goal, is to make sure that the Iroquois remained loyal to the British. And they did. So the Iroquois, as a result of the Albany plan, was they remained loyal. The second thing, or the long-term plan, was to try to create colonial unity. In the same way that they tried to do with the New England Confederation, they tried to do a confederation of all 13 colonies. Now, domestically, or within the colonies, it was a really difficult goal to achieve because the colonies themselves wanted to maintain some of their autonomy, right? So their own sort of self-rule. Now, from the English standpoint, they said, no, absolutely not. You can't have this confederation. And the reason why is because they didn't want them thinking that they were somewhat independent of England. So again, here's the famous cartoon, right? Join or Die. Now, initially, the British made the mistake of allowing some really crappy generals to lead them. One of the biggest mistakes was this guy, General Edward Braddock. He insisted on attacking the French along the frontier. Not a smart idea. What he should have done is he should have gone after the head, right? Cut off the oxygen supply. We'll talk about this in class, by taking Montreal and Quebec, and he didn't. And so what ends up happening is not only does he die, but the natives are going to actually resort to scalping English heads. So what ends up happening is this guy right here, William Pitt, right? And of course, the city of Pittsburgh is named after him. He was a member of the House of Commons. He took command of the war in 1757. And he made the decision that it would be a smarter thing to do to go after Montreal and Quebec and make sure that both those cities fell, cutting off the supply routes. He also enlisted a lot more younger and daring officers. 1758, Fort Louisbourg fell a year after he was in control. 1759, the famous Battle of Quebec, in which the English took Quebec. The English and the French lost both of their really good generals. The French lost the Marquis de Montcalm, and the English lost General James Wolfe. And then by 1760, Montreal had fallen. So the Treaty of Paris of 1763 was the treaty that ended the war. The French had totally kicked out North America. The British got Canada. The French gave Louisiana to Spain because they owed them cash, right, for the war. And so Spain is going to temporarily control Louisiana, and we'll come back to that. France retained some of the sugar islands in the West Indies, okay, but again they had lost the majority control of North America. So again, the consequences, right, being that they are now going to. So this was British before, right? So like I said before, okay, these are all British gains right here. Okay, and then you can see Spanish before, right? Spanish losses, and so you can see how much land the Treaty of Paris is going to grant the English. So a couple of things for the colonists, right? Number one, they come out of this war very confident, feeling really good about themselves. They also realize that, like, fighting along the English, they were like, the English aren't the greatest military people. Like, they may have just a lot of soldiers. And again, when I say the British, right, I mean it's their brethren, right? Like, they are English and British and all these other things, right? But they look at the English who are from home, the soldiers, right, and they think, man, like, here we thought they were like this superpower military force with superhuman strength and power, but really they're not. One of the things that we'll see is that friction began to develop between the British and the colonists as a result. The colonists were hoping to finally be seen as equals by their brethren from home, but the English will continue to see them as kind of being like secondary citizens. The Brits were concerned that some Americans continued to trade with the French because they did. People like John Hancock during the French-Canadian War was still trading with the French, making a lot of money. Many Americans were also refusing to give money, supplies, and troops to the cause, which caused the British to be really pissed off. The colonists from all 13 colonies for the first time had found themselves that they had a lot in common, right? Things like language, traditions, and ideals of freedom. This was important. So the French threat was gone. The colonists could roam freely. Colonists felt less dependent on the British, right? This is pretty important right here. Natives could no longer play the French and the English off one another. And then this happens. This is pretty important, right? Chi Pontiac of the Ottawa, he decides to get as many of the Huron tribes together, including his own, right, the Ottawa. And what they decided to do was come together in strength and attack the frontier at the end of the French and Indian War. As a result, the British ordered blankets with smallpox to be distributed to the natives. Some of them died. And then in 1763, really important, English Parliament ratified the Proclamation of 1763. They realized, man, like, we have this problem with these native people. Like, we need to figure out, like, what we're going to do. So what the Proclamation of 1763 did is it kept the English, right, the colonists, from crossing over the Appalachians so they would not have to fight the Indians or the natives, right? And so now the Parliament thought, you know what, like, this is a good idea, right, until we can solve the quote-unquote Indian problem. The colonists are going to be pissed, right? They're going to say, we just fought this war for land, and you're not going to let us move into some of the land that we just won? That's ridiculous. Picture of Chief Pontiac. And, of course, the Proclamation of 1763, right? So, forbidden from crossing into that land.